So, Mr. Hannan, Brexit has been a mistake, and maybe a mistake for correction. And something else, was it, among other things, a matter of arrogance to you?
Well, it was a matter of democracy, to begin by stating the obvious. More people in Britain voted to leave the European Union than have ever voted for anything in British history. It seems rather appropriate in a way that we're discussing democracy in the shadow of the Parthenon. We like to think in Britain that we exported, or at least we refined and encouraged other countries to follow the sublime ideal that laws shouldn't be passed, taxes shouldn't be raised, except by elected representatives. But of course, we were inspired by older models. And actually, I think this is the first time in my life that I can use the phrase "in the shadow of the Acropolis" literally, because it touches this hotel, or at least it did this morning. You saw the sun moving behind it. Greece and the United Kingdom, apart from this peculiar claim on the credentials of democratic accountability, have one other, rather more practical thing in common. Ours are the only two countries in the EU that trade more with non-EU states than with EU states. It's very, very unusual. And yet in Britain, that has led to a big debate about whether we should be widening our economic horizons and diversifying away from a relatively declining customs union. In Greece, to the best of my knowledge, there is no such debate, which is understandable for a series of historical reasons. But you asked me to contextualize the British vote, and let me do it by beginning with a couple of myths. We just heard Mr. Manos say it was demagoguery and we didn't have the right information and so on. And to be honest, if I were reading only overseas media to describe what had happened on the 23rd of June, that would be my impression as well. Almost every interview I have outside the UK begins from the proposition that Britain voted for nativism or protectionism, that this was a vote against immigration, against foreigners, or against cooperation with the outside world. And you also, of course, hear that argument from some die-hard Remain supporters in the United Kingdom. But I assure you, my friends, if that had been the kind of campaign that we ran, if Vote Leave had genuinely run the angry and nativist campaign that the other side imagines that we had run, or would like us to have run, we wouldn't have come close to winning. We wouldn't have got into double figures. You have to carry people with you with optimism, with a vision of something better. We can swap anecdotes. I'll tell you as a matter of, it's almost an iron law, like a law of physics. If any British person says to you, the Brexit vote was all about immigration, I guarantee that you are speaking to a Remain voter. I guarantee it. So the first rule of politics is that nobody ever really listens to the other side. Very, very few people read the arguments of the opposition. What they read instead are their friends' report of what the opposition is supposed to be saying. And this created the idea that the whole of the Leave campaign was reactive, anti-modern, or whatever. We can swap anecdotes or we can look at opinion polls. All of the data agrees that the top issue for Leave voters, by a long way, was the issue of democracy. Or, if you prefer, of sovereignty or self-rule, the principle that decisions affecting the UK should be taken within the UK. For what it's worth, all of the private polls that we ran in Vote Leave agreed with the published polls on this point. Immigration was a second issue. It was a very distant second. And even for the people citing immigration as their chief motive, all of the evidence is that they did not expect or even particularly want a very radical reduction in absolute numbers. What people wanted, and I think legitimately wanted, was a sense that we were ultimately in control of roughly who came in and roughly in what numbers, a right that other countries take for granted. There was, for example, a very prominent legal battle that happened to come during the campaign, involving the daughter-in-law of an Islamist hate preacher called Abu Hamza. She'd been incarcerated and was then supposed to be deported at the end of her conviction. She was a Jordanian national. There shouldn't have been any problem. She complained not to the European Court of Human Rights, but to the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, on grounds that this was violating her son's right as an EU citizen. He was a small child. And we found ourselves, therefore, unable to deport a Jordanian criminal to her country of origin because she'd had a son born in the UK. Now, for a lot of people citing immigration, that was the thing. It wasn't really about absolute numbers of people. It was a sense of, hang on, surely we should be allowed to distinguish between desirable and undesirable cases. And I think that was a not unreasonable proposition. As for the idea that this was a vote for protectionism, for autarky, or for a rejection of economic globalization, there is a consensus in the United Kingdom behind free trade in a way that there is in few other countries apart from maybe Hong Kong or Singapore. To argue that Britain just did the equivalent of voting for Donald Trump is simply to misunderstand the motives and the arguments of the Leave campaign. Donald Trump argued that you should vote for him because he wouldn't have a free trade deal with China. It's a big part of his shtick. British Eurosceptics argued through the campaign that we should leave the EU because we did want a free trade deal with China, and with India, and with Australia, and for that matter, with all of the bits of the world that are still growing. A constant refrain of our argument is that throughout the 21st century, every continent had experienced significant economic growth except Antarctica and Europe. Britain saw itself as a maritime, global nation, merchant nation, a nation connected to every continent and every archipelago. And the argument of the Leave campaign, you can agree or disagree with it, but at least acknowledge it for what it was. The argument of the Leave campaign was, outside the European Union, we will have a more free trade, more deregulated, and more global future.